A millionaire plans to humiliate a poor elderly man at an exclusive party. But what happens when he touches the piano leaves? Everyone's speechless and turns the night into a reality check. What if a simple touch on the piano could transform not just a party, but a man's perception of what truly matters in life? Richard Montgomery, an arrogant millionaire, never imagined that his attempt to humiliate an elderly man at his luxury party would lead him to reflect on his own weaknesses. At 45 years old, Richard was the epitome of wealth and power. Born into a wealthy family in New York, he dedicated his life to building an empire of luxurious businesses, surrounding himself with influential people and showcasing his status at every event. To him, respect was a currency bought with money, and anyone who didn't fit into his world of opulence was, at the very least, contemptible. His insecurity about his lack of creative talent led him to belittle those who lived outside the standards of wealth and success that he so highly valued. So, when Richard spotted an elderly man in simple clothes at his exclusive party, a cruel idea took shape in his mind. He needed to ridicule that man in front of his guests, reinforcing his own image of power. Henry Thompson, at 75 years old, was a man who carried the wisdom and scars of a difficult life. A former renowned pianist, he had stepped away from music after the death of his wife, who had always inspired him. He lived in a small town in the countryside, far from the spotlight and social pressures. An unexpected invitation from an old friend brought him to Richard's opulent party, where he felt like a fish out of water. With his modest clothes, Henry stood out negatively among guests adorned in designer outfits and expensive jewelry. However, he carried with him a silent dignity and a deep connection to music, an aspect of his life he had left behind but still pulsed in his heart. The party was in full swing at Richard's stunning penthouse on the Upper East Side. The environment was decorated with contemporary art, and the view of Central Park was breathtaking. Conversations revolved around million-dollar businesses and new acquisitions, while the ambient music seemed merely a backdrop to the ambitions of those present. Richard, bored with what he considered dull conversations, cast a disdainful glance at Henry, who was leaning against a wall, clearly out of place. In a moment of impulse, he decided to provoke the old man, seeking amusement at the expense of someone who had no idea what awaited him. Before we continue with this thrilling story, take a moment to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any stories, and let us know which city you're watching this video from in the comments. When Richard challenged Henry to show some talent, many guests laughed while others watched with curiosity. Henry, although initially surprised, maintained his composure and accepted the challenge. He approached the Steinway grand piano that shone under the lights, a status symbol that was now becoming a stage for his redemption. The tension in the air was palpable, and all eyes turned to him, ready to witness what could be a moment of humiliation. As he sat at the piano, Henry felt a mix of nervousness and familiarity. The music he had kept inside for so long began to flow from his fingers. He played a classical piece, and the room, which had previously been filled with laughter and mockery, began to silence. The melody, charged with emotion and technique, reverberated through the glass walls of the penthouse, capturing the attention of everyone present. What was meant to be a moment of ridicule for Henry transformed into a display of mastery that challenged Richard's superficiality and worldview. As the music filled the space, Richard, who expected to humiliate Henry, saw his own. He felt small in the presence of the greatness that music brought. The guests, who had been uninterested before, were now moved, touched by the depth of the performance. After finishing, Henry stood up humbly, thanked everyone, and began to leave the party, taking with him a renewed dignity. Richard, stunned, remained there, confronting the reality that despite all his money and status, he did not possess what truly mattered, the ability to touch people's souls. In the end, what should have been a night of humiliation became a moment of deep reflection, where both Henry and Richard discovered truths about themselves that would change their lives forever. Richard Montgomery watched, perplexed, as Henry Thompson left the party. The sound of the music still echoed in his mind, and he was overwhelmed by a wave of contradictory emotions. The scene that had unfolded before him felt like a movie, but it wasn't. It was the reality he had refused to see for so long. The mocking laughter of the guests that had transformed into applause resonated in his head like an echo of his own failures. He had tried to ridicule a man who, despite his simple appearance, possessed a greatness that Richard had never understood. The guests, initially excited, were now in a state of reflection. Some approached Henry, thanking him for his performance. Meanwhile, Richard found himself paralyzed, struggling against the frustration building inside him. He had always been the center of attention, surrounded by admirers who glorified him. However, in that moment, Henry had overshadowed his presence. What had once been merely a show of ostentation had now become a stage for a lesson in humility. Richard's mind was racing. He couldn't understand why that old man, who apparently had nothing to offer, had managed to touch not only the piano, but also the souls of the guests. It was as if he had exposed Richard's fragility and insecurities. Anger and confusion mixed together, and at the same time a spark of curiosity began to emerge. What was behind that aged and modest figure? What stories did he carry? Unbeknownst to him, Richard started to question his own beliefs about the value of people and what really mattered in life. Henry, on his part, left the party with a mix of relief and sadness. Although the performance had been a success, the pain of losing his wife still accompanied him. The music he played was a tribute to her, an attempt to reclaim what had been left behind. As he exited the luxurious penthouse, he felt the guests' gazes still on him. Some admired him, while others, like Richard, were lost in their own confusion. However, for Henry, that moment was not about recognition, but about rediscovering a part of himself that he had buried. Amidst this introspection, Richard decided he needed to understand more about Henry. He knew he couldn't let that night end like this. The challenge of confronting his own arrogance was daunting, but curiosity pushed him to act. He sought information about Henry, and after some investigation, discovered that the old pianist lived in a small town, far from the glamour he had always valued. Richard then decided to visit Henry, not only to apologize but to understand what had led him to distance himself from music and the life he once had. The trip was a challenge in itself. Richard felt uncomfortable in his luxury limousine, surrounded by the simple reality of the small town. He was not used to dealing with people who were not impressed by his money or status. Upon arriving at Henry's home, a small, modest building, Richard hesitated. The house seemed at odds with the extravagance he was accustomed to, but there was a quiet beauty to that place that drew him in. When Henry opened the door, the look of surprise on his face made Richard's heart race. He didn't know what to say, but the determination to understand that man compelled him to continue. Henry, though wary, invited Richard in. The room was filled with books, sheet music, and old photographs, a reflection of the life Henry had lived. Richard realized he was facing a world he did not understand, a world where true wealth was not measured in money, but in experiences and connections. Throughout the conversation, Richard found himself confronted with a new kind of challenge. He needed to let go of his armor of arrogance and allow his vulnerability to emerge. Henry, for his part, was also facing his own demons, reminiscing about a life full of joys and sorrows, but a sense of hope began to blossom between them. Both were in search of redemption, a fresh start that could transform not only their lives, but also the way they viewed the world. The friendship that was beginning to form between them promised to be a journey filled with challenges and discoveries. Richard, by opening himself up to Henry's wisdom and experience, began to question his deep-seated beliefs about success and happiness. Henry, on the other hand, faced the pain of loss and the fear of reconnecting with music, but he felt that perhaps, just perhaps, he could find a new purpose alongside someone who, at first glance, seemed so different from him. Thus, under the soft light of dusk, two men from distinct worlds embarked on a path that would lead them to confront their weaknesses and rediscover what truly mattered in life. The music, which had been the lost link between them, was now becoming the bridge to an unexpected and transformative future. Richard Montgomery sat in Henry's small room, surrounded by books and sheet music, trying to absorb the new reality unfolding before him. The atmosphere was thick with the history and pain of the man in front of him. Henry, with his calloused hands and deep gaze, seemed like a sage carrying the weight of his experiences. Richard felt out of place, like an intruder in a world he did not understand. Music, which had once been merely superficial entertainment for him, now seemed to have a depth he had never imagined. However, insecurity began to creep into his mind. He wondered if he was truly capable of change. The criticisms he had received during the party still echoed in his head, and the comparison between himself and Henry was undeniable. While Henry played with passion, Richard saw himself only as a businessman, a conqueror of status and wealth. A sense of frustration began to grow within him. a conflict between his desire for change and the inner voice telling him it was impossible. Henry, sensing Richard's internal struggle, decided to share a bit of his own story. He spoke about the music he had lost after his wife's death, how each note played was a memory he tried to revive. Richard felt a pang of empathy, but at the same time, he couldn't shake off the feeling of inadequacy. He wanted to connect, but each word from Henry seemed to highlight his own lack of worth. As the conversation progressed, the tension began to intensify. Richard, in a moment of vulnerability, confessed that he had always been afraid of being seen as weak. Henry, in turn, challenged him to face that weakness. "True strength lies in accepting our limitations," he said, with a firm look. That phrase resonated in Richard's mind, but he couldn't understand how it could apply to his life. The friendship that was beginning to form between them was tested in an unexpected moment. Richard, in a spur of the moment, invited Henry to perform at a gala event he was organizing. He imagined that if Henry could play in front of a larger audience, it might help heal him. But Henry hesitated. He didn't want to relive the pain of performing, especially in an environment that represented everything he had left behind. Richard, frustrated, insisted, convinced that it was the only way for Henry to reconnect with his passion. The misunderstanding became a point of tension. Richard was so focused on helping that he didn't realize he was forcing Henry to confront his own pain. Henry, on the other hand, felt that Richard didn't understand what music truly meant to him. The words began to grow sharp, and the friendship that seemed promising was now on the brink of collapse. In the days that followed, Richard felt lost. He tried to distract himself with work, but the idea of having hurt Henry consumed him. He reflected on his actions and began to realize that behind his arrogance was a man yearning for genuine connection. The pain of seeing the friendship threatened forced him to confront his own limitations, and he began to question what he truly wanted from that relationship. It was an internal struggle, a battle between the desire to be admired and the need to be true. Meanwhile, Henry grappled with his own insecurities. The thought of performing again terrified him. He felt he had lost the right to be called a musician. Memories of his wife haunted him, and the music that once brought joy was now a source of pain. Richard's pressure left him even more confused, and he wondered if he could really open up to the world again. In a moment of reflection, Richard decided he needed to apologize. He no longer wanted to be that arrogant man trying to control everything around him. He decided to visit Henry again, not as a conqueror but as someone seeking understanding. Upon arriving at Henry's home, he realized that the humble residence of the old pianist was a symbol of everything he had learned about true wealth, love, pain, and the beauty of vulnerability. When Henry opened the door, the expression on his face was one of surprise, but also of relief. Richard apologized, not just for the words he had said, but for not having understood the depth of Henry's pain. The conversation flowed slowly, and this time, both were willing to listen. Richard shared his own insecurities, and Henry, touched by the sincerity of the man who had once looked down on him, began to open his heart. Their journey was still far from easy. New challenges would arise as they both tried to balance their lives and emotions. But at that moment, the two men were ready to face their fears together, starting to understand that true overcoming was not about avoiding pain, but embracing it and using it as a springboard for a more authentic future. That day, the city was shrouded in thick fog, as if the very air was laden with uncertainties. Richard decided it was time to do something different, to break away from the routine that imprisoned him in a life of superficiality. He recalled a recent conversation with Henry, where the old musician had mentioned a recital that would take place in a small theater in the city. Initially, Richard hadn't cared much, but now the idea began to take root in his mind. Upon arriving at the theater, Richard found a cozy, albeit intimate atmosphere. The walls were adorned with photos of artists who had performed there over the years, all seeming to capture moments of pure emotion and dedication. He sat in a corner, observing the people as they arrived. Around him were both familiar and unfamiliar faces, but all shared the same anticipation. This made Richard feel a bit out of place, as if he were still outside of that world. When the lights dimmed and the recital began, Richard felt a wave of emotions he couldn't fully comprehend. The music filled the air, and each note seemed to touch something deep within him. He saw Henry on stage, his figure illuminated under the spotlight, and in that moment something changed. Richard realized that music was not just a pastime, but a language that transcended words and connected souls. As Henry played, Richard began to re-evaluate his own life. He had always measured success in terms of wealth and recognition, but now he saw a new perspective. True success could be found in authenticity, in the ability to open up to the world and connect with others. He remembered the conversations he had with Henry, the pain and struggle the musician faced. That music was an extension of his soul, a testament to his struggle and triumph. However, the performance was about to reach an unexpected climax. During an emotional solo, Henry stopped playing. Silence filled the room and Richard felt a wave of concern. He saw the expression of pain on Henry's face, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. The man who had always appeared strong and wise now seemed vulnerable, exposed before an audience that loved him. Richard, in an impulse, stood up and went to the stage. He didn't know if he was doing the right thing, but something inside him urged him to act. Upon reaching Henry's side, he whispered words of encouragement, telling him that everyone was there to support him, that music was a gift, not an obligation. Henry looked at him, and in that glance Richard saw the struggle between pain and hope. The silence seemed to scream, and the tension in the room was palpable. After moments that felt eternal, Henry took a deep breath and, with a hesitant gesture, began to play again. The music flowed again, but this time something was different. Richard realized that the performance was more than just a presentation. It was a shared journey between the musician and the audience. Henry's emotions intertwined with those of everyone present, and Richard felt he was part of something greater. After the recital, the room erupted in applause. Richard felt relieved, but also deeply moved. What he had witnessed on that stage was not just a man struggling with his insecurities. It was a demonstration of strength and vulnerability that helped him reassess his own life. He realized that his pursuit of recognition and success felt empty, and that he too needed to confront his weakness. In the following days, Richard reflected on what he had learned. He recognized that, like Henry, he also had his own insecurities and fears. The pressure to be successful had distanced him from the things that truly mattered. The friendship forming with Henry was a sign that he could change, that there was room for vulnerability and authenticity in his life. This revelation led him to seek a new direction. Richard began to get involved in projects that promoted music and art in the community, aiming to support emerging talents. He wanted to create a space where people could express themselves, where the pain and beauty of life could be explored through art. In doing so, he began to understand that true success was not about being admired, but about being true to himself and to others. Richard's journey was just beginning, but now he had a new purpose. His friendship with Henry became a cornerstone in his life, a constant reminder that all of us at some point struggle to find our place in the world, and perhaps true strength lay in embracing that struggle, in allowing experiences to shape who we were and connect us to each other in a genuine way. Richard was on a new path, one that led him to a deeper understanding of himself and the world around him. Henry's recital had been a turning point, and he felt the change pulsing within him. However, this transformation was not without challenges. As he ventured into his new mission, unexpected obstacles began to arise. In the early days after the recital, Richard tried to connect with local artists. He frequented cafes, art exhibitions, and small performances, always in search of new voices and talents. Yet insecurity accompanied him. Many times he questioned whether he could truly make a difference. The pressure of being a facilitator of art made him feel vulnerable, almost as if he were back on stage facing the gaze of an attentive audience. He had a burning desire to help, but doubt haunted him. One night, while organizing an event in a small community space, Richard met Clara, a young artist who painted murals. She was full of ideas, but her confidence seemed shaken. Clara had tried to exhibit her works in various galleries, but always faced rejections. Richard saw a reflection of his own struggle in Clara. He remembered Henry and how the musician had faced his own insecurities on the night of the recital. Inspired, Richard decided to open up to Clara. He confessed to her that he also had fears. For a long time, he believed that success was only about fame and money, but now he saw that it was about being true and helping others express themselves. Clara looked at him in surprise, as if she were hearing a revelation. The conversation flowed, and Richard realized that his vulnerability was creating a genuine connection. That exchange of experiences made both feel a little stronger. As he became more involved with the artistic community, Richard began organizing small exhibitions and musical events. He felt a new energy watching artists perform and share their stories. However, The responsibility of managing these events brought with it a knee. Richard often found himself overwhelmed, trying to balance his daily work with this new passion. The nights grew long, and he frequently wondered if he was dedicating too much to this new project. One night, while reviewing the details of an upcoming event, Richard received a message from Henry. The musician invited him to meet at a local cafe. Richard was exhausted, but he felt he needed to meet his friend. Upon arrival, he found Henry sitting at a table, his expression carrying a mix of concern and excitement. Henry said he was thinking of doing something bigger, something that involved more people, but he was afraid he wouldn't succeed. Richard listened attentively. He realized that even someone as talented and admired as Henry still struggled with insecurities. This made him reflect on his own fear of failure. Richard responded that whatever it was, he did not need to do it alone. They both knew what it was like to struggle, and they could help each other. That conversation was a balm for Richard. He realized he was not alone on his journey. The connection he had formed with Henry and Clara was becoming an essential support. With Henry's support and Clara's energy, Richard felt reinvigorated. However, new challenges soon presented themselves. While trying to organize an art and music festival in the city, he encountered resistance from some community members. Many did not believe that an event like that could succeed. Richard felt the weight of frustration, but instead of giving up, he decided to use the rejection as fuel. He began talking to people, explaining the importance of art and music in the life of the community, how they could unite people and give voice to those who had none. It was a difficult job, but Richard was determined. In his interactions, he saw how art could be a bridge, connecting people through their stories and experiences. The pressure was mounting, but Richard began to find strength in his vulnerability. He remembered Henry's recital and how that moment of uncertainty had transformed into something beautiful. He also realized that by opening up to others, he was creating a space for them to express themselves as well. With each conversation, each interaction, Richard felt more confident. Amid all this, Richard began to find a new balance. He understood that his journey was not just about him, but about everyone around him. His fears and insecurities began to be seen as part of the process, not as insurmountable barriers. With each step he took, Richard became a little stronger, a little more authentic, and above all, a little more connected to the world and the people surrounding him. Richard found himself at a crucial point in his life. The restlessness that had accompanied him in the days leading up to Henry's recital had now transformed into an overwhelming desire to make a difference in the lives of those around him. He had embarked on a new path, filled with promises, but also with challenges that would test his determination and courage. In the first days after the recital, Richard threw himself wholeheartedly into the search for new artistic talents in the community. He would sit in cafes, attend exhibitions, and get involved in small performances. However, insecurity followed him like a shadow. He had a genuine desire to help, but doubt always lingered overhead. What if I can't do it? He thought. The pressure of being a facilitator of art made him feel vulnerable, as if he were back on stage facing the critical gaze of the audience. One night, while organizing an event in a community space, he met Clara, an artist full of ideas but insecure. Richard noticed that, like him, Clara was also struggling with rejection and a lack of confidence. By sharing their fears, Richard felt lighter, and the connection they formed grew stronger. That exchange of experiences became a turning point, reminding him that vulnerability could create genuine bonds. As Richard delved deeper into the artistic scene, he began organizing exhibitions, and watching artists perform and share their stories brought him new energy. However, the responsibility that came with these events became a burden. He struggled to balance daily work with his new passion, often questioning whether he was dedicating too much. Exhaustion was palpable, but the desire to make a difference kept him moving. One night, Richard received a message from Henry, inviting him for coffee. Despite his fatigue, he knew he needed to meet his friend. Upon seeing him, he realized that Henry was also dealing with his own insecurities. The conversation between them became a catharsis, where Richard realized he was not alone. The friendship that had formed between them, along with Clara's, became an invaluable source of support. With Henry's encouragement and Clara's creative energy, Richard felt revitalized. However, new challenges arose when he decided to organize a festival of art and music. He faced resistance from community members who did not believe the event could be successful. Frustration threatened to discourage him, But instead of giving up, Richard chose to use the rejection as fuel. He began engaging in dialogue with people, explaining the importance of art in the community's life and how it could unite the residents. Each conversation became a learning opportunity. Richard discovered that by opening up to others and sharing his own experiences, he not only strengthened his position, but also encouraged others to express themselves. This exchange of ideas and stories made Richard feel more confident. He realized that success was not just about gaining fame or recognition, but about creating a space where everyone could feel valued and heard. Over time, Richard began to find a new balance. He understood that his journey was not only about himself, but about the community that surrounded him. The fears and insecurities that had once paralyzed him transformed into valuable lessons. He learned that vulnerability was, in fact, a strength, and allowing himself to feel and express his emotions made him more authentic. The pressure that had once overwhelmed him now became a driving force to continue. As the festival approached, Richard saw the community coming together, filling him with awe. The connection he had formed with Clara and Henry grew stronger. They were all in this journey together, supporting each other in their personal and collective struggles. Richard realized that the friendship that had emerged among them was a fundamental pillar in his growth. Finally, on the day of the festival, as he watched people gathering to celebrate art and music, Richard felt a wave of gratitude. All the effort and difficulties he had faced were worth it. He had learned to trust himself and accept help from others. What once seemed a distant dream was now becoming a vibrant reality. Richard understood that his journey did not end there. He had found a new understanding of what success meant. It was about impacting people's lives, creating a space for expression, and strengthening bonds that transcend insecurities. He felt he was just getting started, and that every step he took brought him closer to a future full of possibilities. The day of the festival arrived, and the city pulsed with vibrant energy. Richard walked through the stalls set up in the square, the smiles of the people around him filling him with hope. However, a knot formed in his stomach as he realized that despite all the preparation, there was a shadow of insecurity hovering over him. The event was a reflection of his hard work, but also of his vulnerabilities. What if something went wrong? What if people didn't feel welcome? These thoughts tormented him as he looked at the crowd. Just minutes before the festival was set to begin, Richard received a call from Clara. She was stuck in traffic and wouldn't make it in time. Despair washed over him. Without Clara, who would lead the opening presentation? Richard knew she was an essential part of the event, and the thought of starting without her made him anxious. He took a deep breath and tried to calm his heart, but the pressure felt unbearable. At that moment, Henry appeared, noticing Richard's anguished expression. "What happened?" he asked, concerned. Richard explained the situation, and Henry, with his usual calmness, suggested that Richard start the presentation and that Clara would arrive as soon as she could. Richard hesitated, but the determination in Henry's eyes encouraged him. Henry was there, and that alone was a sign that they were in this. Richard felt a spark of courage ignite within him. With one last look at the crowd, Richard stepped onto the stage. The bright lights and the expectant faces made him nervous, but he knew he needed to overcome this challenge. He remembered all the conversations he had had with Clara and Henry, where they shared their fears and insecurities. He took a deep breath and began to speak, his voice trembling at first, but soon steadying. "Welcome to our Art and Music Festival," he announced, feeling the energy of the audience. He shared a bit about his journey, about how art had the power to connect people and transform lives. As he spoke, Richard realized he was no longer alone. Every gaze he met, every smile he received, was a reminder that everyone was together in this celebration. He felt stronger, as if the vulnerability that had once paralyzed him was now a source of power. The presentation continued, and Richard saw Clara arriving, breathless but with a sparkle in her eyes. Her presence brought immense relief. Together they introduced a series of local artists, each bringing their unique story and talent. Richard felt emotional seeing how the community came together, applauding and supporting one another. He realized that his role was not just that of a facilitator, but of someone who had helped create a space where everyone could shine. However, the climax of the Koi. Our talented but still insecure artist was about to perform. Richard knew he struggled with anxiety, and the pressure was evident in his eyes. Richard decided to intervene. He approached the artist and, in a gesture of friendship, shared his own insecurities. "I'm scared too," he said, "but art is about expressing yourself. Just be yourself." The artist looked at Richard, and the connection between them was instant. When the artist stepped onto the stage, Richard stayed by his side, offering silence. With each note played, the artist's confidence grew, and Richard felt a wave of emotion. He realized that in that moment, he was living what he had always wanted, not just to make a difference, but to be part of someone's transformation. The festival concluded with applause and laughter, and Richard felt a wave of gratitude. He had faced his greatest challenge and in doing so, discovered his true strength. The journey was not just about him, but about everyone around him. He understood that vulnerability and friendship were essential to his growth. As the crowd dispersed, Richard and Clara embraced, and Henry joined them. The three souls who had found each other amid insecurities and challenges now shared an unbreakable bond. Richard smiled, feeling that he had finally found his place. His journey didn't end there. It was just the beginning of a path filled with possibilities and new stories to tell. He realized that true success lay in the connections he had formed and the courage he had cultivated to be authentic. After the festival, the city still resonated with the memories of that special day. Richard, Clara, and Henry sat at one of the now empty stalls, feeling a sense of accomplishment and relief. The sun began to set, painting the sky orange and pink, reflecting the joy still pulsing in their hearts. Richard looked at his friends and smiled, feeling grateful to have them by his side. "You have no idea how much this meant to me," Richard said, his voice full of emotion. "I was so worried about everything going wrong, but when I saw the community coming together, I realized the festival wasn't just mine, it was all of ours." Clara, still with a sparkle in her eyes, replied, "You did an amazing job, Richard. And facing your insecurities like that was inspiring. We all have our fears, but you turned them into something beautiful." Henry nodded, adding, "Art has that power. It connects us and makes us feel that we're not alone. And you, Richard, were the catalyst for that to happen." As they talked, Richard reflected on the journey he had made up to that point. He remembered how many times he hesitated to take the first step, how his insecurities nearly prevented him from realizing the festival. But now, sitting there surrounded by friends, he realized that those vulnerabilities were not weaknesses, but essential parts of who he was. "I didn't know I could feel so free sharing my fears," Richard said thoughtfully. "That artist, for example, reminded me of myself. I felt so connected to him. This made me understand that we are all in this journey together." Clara smiled, perfectly understanding what Richard meant. Vulnerability creates empathy. When you open up, other people feel comfort. That's how we build true relationships. Henry, who always had a pragmatic view, looked at his friends with a smile. And most importantly, "Richard, you not only created a festival but also a space where people felt valued and heard. This is something that goes beyond any event." As the sun slowly set, Richard remembered every smile, every applause, and every moment of connection he witnessed during the festival. He realized that day was not just a milestone in his life, but the beginning of something much greater. The insecurities that once paralyzed him were now a source of strength. "I want to keep doing this," Richard stated, with renewed determination. "I want this connection to last. The festival may have ended, but the community we created should not stop here." Clara and Henry agreed, and together they began discussing ideas for future events. Richard felt a wave of excitement, imagining what they could create together. He realized that by facing his fears, he not only transformed his own life, but also left a lasting impact on the lives of those around him. As the night fell and the stars began to shine, Richard looked at his friends and said, "I wouldn't be here without you. Thank you for believing in me." Clara, moved, replied, "We will always be here, Richard, because that's what friends do." Henry, with his practical way, concluded, "And remember, every step you take is a step we all take together. Let's continue to create, support, and celebrate art and community." With those words, Richard felt an inner peace. He knew the journey would be full of challenges, but now he was ready to face them. With Clara and Henry's help, he was determined to turn his vulnerabilities into opportunities, using art as a means of connection and transformation. And so, under the starry sky, Richard began to dream of the future, feeling that his place in the world had finally been found. On that starry night, Richard, Clara, and Henry sat together, feeling the energy that still vibrated in the air. The conversation flowed naturally, filled with laughter and plans for the future. Richard realized that throughout the festival, he not only overcame his insecurities, but also learned the importance of sharing his vulnerabilities. He understood that every step taken there was not just an act of courage, but an invitation for others to open up as well. As the moon illuminated the sky, Richard reflected on how his journey had changed his perspective on success. He used to think success was only about numbers, about how many people would attend the festival or how much he would raise. Now he understood that true success lay in the connections he formed, the smiles he witnessed, and the stories he heard. The festival was not just an event. It was a celebration of community and art, something that would continue to live in every heart it touched. Over time, Richard, Clara, and Henry began organizing regular meetups. The festival became an annual tradition, but the interactions and friendships they cultivated extended far beyond that. They created a space where local artists could express themselves, where people gathered to share their stories, and where everyone felt valued. Thus, Richard not only transformed his own insecurities into strength, but also helped turn the city into a more united and welcoming place. However, not everything was easy. Richard faced challenges and criticism along the way, but with his friends by his side, he learned to see these obstacles as opportunities for growth. Through art, Richard and his friends found ways to overcome difficulties, showing that resilience and friendship can conquer even the greatest challenges. At one point, they decided to organize a special event to honor everyone who participated in the festival. With the support of community members, they managed to raise funds to help struggling artists. Richard, Clara, and Henry realized that by giving back, they were creating a cycle of positivity and mutual support that spread like a wave. Looking back, Richard felt grateful for all the lessons learned. He now knew that life was a journey of ups and downs, but each experience contributed to his growth. He became more confident, more secure, and more connected to others. The friendship he built with Clara and Henry was one of the most valuable things he possessed. In the end, Richard understood that the true revenge against his insecurities and fears was to live fully, celebrate life, and encourage others to do the same. He had transformed his pain into something beautiful and meaningful, and that was the greatest achievement of all. The story of Richard, Clara, and Henry echoes an important invitation for all of us. Don't let your fears stop you from acting. Life is made of challenges, but it's through vulnerability and connection that we find true strength. Share your experiences in the comments and inspire others to open up and connect as well. Together, we can create a more welcoming and supportive world. Like and subscribe for more stories that touch the heart and remind us of the power of friendship and art. Don't miss the opportunity to be part of this journey.